Why did Joyce want us? Why was it so important? I remember one time, a long time ago, going hunting with Danny. And I walked into the kitchen. And how I knew that Danny was a man that I wanted to be like, because I walked into the kitchen and Danny had kneeled down in the kitchen saying his prayer. Any man that kneels down and says a prayer before we do anything, was in my opinion, I didn't see that. I was not raised in that. But to see a man, because I don't know about y'all, you young guys, like I was watching AJ bend down a while ago. I had a baby bend down. Yeah. I remember them days. I seen an old man walk in the store the other day and he was limping doing something. I said, man. He looked at me and I was like, I get it. He's like, yeah. I said, it don't get no better, does it? He says, no. He says, and you're probably about to find out. I said, sir, I already found out. And I said, you know why they called them the golden years? And he's like, well, yeah. He said, very much gold in them. I said, no, they call them golden year because it costs so much gold to live through these years. And so the thing is that I myself have seen my world drastically change. I see the spinning. I knew something was wrong, but yet I couldn't mold myself around the concept. But I remember watching Danny pray, and I thought, I want to be that man. Well, the thing is that what drove that man to pray? What drove that man to, because again, we've talked about this. Intellectually, I could see where people do not believe in God. Because intellectually, you're telling me that a person, a man, can kneel down and instantly connect to this infinite being that's beyond comprehension. And we just got this, anytime we want to call God. Anybody, it's like Lance and I. We played phone tag. I was mowing, so he'd call. And so he'd call me when I'm mowing. So when I get done mowing the yard, doing whatever I'm doing, an hour later I call him back. Now he's doing something. We spend there all day long trying to reach each other. And I finally sent him, because his first call, he didn't leave a message. I was like, well, did you butt dial me? Because people butt dial. That's a real thing. And so usually my thinking is if somebody doesn't leave a message or send a text, I tell everybody, if you want to get a hold of me, send me a text. You can get a hold of me. You can get a hold of me different ways, but if you don't leave a message, what do I instantly think? Well, I don't know.
Not important.
It's not really important. And so the thing is so I finally sent Lance a text back because I'd called him about an hour or so later. I ain't heard back from him. And I said, hey, man, did you mean to call me? Because you didn't say anything in your question. You didn't leave a message. You didn't leave a text, anything like that. He said, no, man, it's cool. He said, I'll talk to you about it tomorrow. Well, tomorrow? Never heard a word. So I just defined it as being not that important. If we cannot get a hold of each other, I can see where intellectually a person can argue the existence of God. So you're telling me that you can't call Lance, but yet you can close your eyes instantly and connect to God, a God that you can't see, a God you can't hear, a God you never really can prove that you heard from God. I can see that argument. But yet, I can tell you from experience, you can live in this world without God. I was talking to a lady the other day, and she was talking about the difference between Christians and Christians. And she made a comment about there's going to be a lot of people. I said, yeah, because that Sunday, that's what we talked about, was those people that's going to stand for and say, God didn't I, God didn't I, God didn't I. And I said, there's going to be a lot of people who are fooled and who will go through it. And so I said, I find myself now, the Bible says to ensure your own salvation. Make sure of your own salvation. So I'm trying to go through a list and checking these things off. Well, one of the things that I find is that one of the first disqualifiers of your religion is the fact that you have to prove your religion. Does that make sense? In other words, when your religion, Kai, is based upon God didn't I, what does that tell you? That tells you that you knew that there was a flaw somewhere because you had had these lists of all the checklists of all the things. What was it? The thing is that when you read about David and David's failures, you hear that he was a man after God's own heart, but yet he sinned. What was the difference? I go back to the story of when David and his mighty men was going to a battle. And there's this dude running beside him. And he was accusing him of being a murderer and adulterer and all this stuff right here. And David's mighty men was like, you mean smoke this sucker? I'm tired of hearing him. David says, no. He says, it's true. Let it go. David knew that that was his price that he had to pay. Because he did it. David knew he did it. All that David had at the end of the day was grace. That's all that he had. That's all that he had was just the belief and the hope that God could forgive him. David never justified what he did. You never hear David justifying, well, she's all hot and everything like that. Man, what is a guy supposed to do? My wife, blah, 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 blah. Well, no. The thing is that what one thing did God say that he will never deny? Never. A broken and contrite heart. In other words, somebody that has no hope, that has nothing. In other words, he's like, God, I cannot defend my religion. If you was put on a court to prove your religious existence, there was no hope. My life was an utter failure. I always go back to one of my family members that's gone now. And I always go back to some of the things that this guy told me. And the guilt that he lived with. But yet, I'm comforted in that guilt because this guy I don't want to go to church because of the hypocrites there. He told me, he says, I don't go to church because I know I'd be a hypocrite. Does that make sense? Yeah. That I would go and try to, in church, live this model, but yet away from church, I'm going to fail him. I'm going to do these things wrong. That was how this guy lived with his existence. But yet I knew that a man's heart is what God judges. Yes, deeds are necessary. Deeds are how a fruit tree is not a fruit tree if the fruit tree doesn't produce fruit. It's just what, Kai? A tree. It doesn't produce fruit. It don't do anything. If the tree doesn't produce fruit, then it becomes a shade tree. And the thing is that the shade tree does not accomplish a goal. If the shade is not in the place it's going to be any use, then what good is it? He says, I'm going to cut it down. But there has to be this point of faith. There has to be this point of grace. At the same time, when we're living in this world of grace, when we're living in this thing, like I was telling this lady, she said something about people. And I said, ma'am, I said, I had an aunt one time, and I said, she really laid it out. She said that this is the only heaven a non-Christian will ever know. But this is the only hell that a Christian will ever have to endure. Think about that. And I've always kind of just imagined that this is the only hell, this is the only trouble, this is the only thing that we're going to have to go through. When I think about it like that, then you ask yourself, what is the point of this suffering? What is the point of this? AJ and I were talking about that. It's to the point that we can take our suffering, we can take our troubles, we can take our trials and turn them in to a witnessing point. We can turn them into even a understanding point of, I've been there. I know what it's like. So if fast forward or actually go back, this is what Joyce was trying to tell us. That you can live this existence. You can live in this world. But if you want any chance of making it in this world, lasting it in this world, if you want any chance whatsoever on, honestly, surviving your first few years of marriage, let's just be honest with you, they're the hard ones. If you want any chance of that, the only chance you're going to have is in God. That's it. Because you can live this world without God. People live this world every day. Ever and I was talking about why certain people are, they're not Christians, but yet they're blessed. There is the verse in the Bible that says it rains on the just as well as the unjust. Well, we have this analogy that the rain is that we're out there at work and all of a sudden here comes the rain and we're like, oh man, come on. I'm trying to get this done. I've got to get this project taken care of, and now here it comes raining. I've got to make a paycheck. Here it comes raining. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about because they were an agricultural community. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have Google. They didn't have none of this stuff. It was not ether-based. It was an economy that was driven by what they produced. If it did not rain upon your crops, guess what you didn't do? You didn't have no crop. Then if you want hay, you need rain, don't you? You've got to have these things. And what it's talking about is that these unjust people will receive the blessing of the rain just as well as you do. But how are Christians judged? When we sit and we look at other people and we begrudge them for what God does or doesn't do. In other words, well, why he got this blessing? I go to church, I got all these things, but yet we don't. The thing is that you're looking at others. It is a time that we have to start looking at ourselves. And so for me, it's hard as a pastor, teacher, when I'll read something and oftentimes I'll see one of you guys in it. I'll see what y'all are going through and I'm like, okay, and then all of a sudden, bam, I have this understanding and then I want you guys to see this thing because why? It's the same reason that Joyce wanted us to be in church because she knew that was where we needed to be. And it bothered her enough that she would actually get on the phone even though she knew that would probably make us mad, but yet she cared enough to say, you need to be in church. She cared enough to say these things. The problem is that what we've talked about is that why do we not want to assume the role of a Christian? What is this thing? Why has pseudo-Christianity become so prevalent? In other words, a Christianity of works. It's like the whole prosperity bullcrap of where they say, God is going to bless you if you give all this stuff. Yes, that is true.
To a certain extent.
Only if you've done it the right way. Because God does not need your money. God doesn't need your money. Your money is not going to pay to save souls. Yes, it'll help pay the bill. Yes, it'll help do the things that we need to do in the church. Yes, it'll help fix the toilets. Yes, it'll do these things. But that is not what God is interested in. God's kingdom is not based upon finances. God's kingdom is based upon humanity. We are God's church. We should be acting as God's church. If we do not contain the hope inside of us, then there is no hope. But the problem is that we want to blend Christianity with ourselves. and Christianity and when ourselves are polar opposites. There is that dividing line.